that of good citizens and productive member of the society. Information is power. If you don't have information, you'll be left behind. So if we have good information, we make good decisions. If we have poor and inferior information, we'll be left on the wayside. So I really feel strongly that information is essential to make valuable and important decisions. So this is the beginning of that circle, that kind of forum that parents have to seek and have, so that the children can have those information with their parents to make a wise decision. Having said that, I'm also part of a product of this new technology, so I get my information all piled up in one little device, thanks to Steve Jobs. When I was growing up, I have to have a camera and various tubes of films. Once the film is done, there will be so many poor people would not be able to be added in that picture, in that photograph. But now we can do unlimited pictures. We can take unlimited photos and store them up. So now I have a privilege to introduce a young man who is quite remarkable and interesting. And this young man is HENOK Nigatu. And he happened to be a person who is studying the same major that I have studied in college. I'm an economist by profession. I taught economics in several universities over 35 years. Don't look at me as if I'm young. I'm an older person, seasoned, like a good wine, older, aged, okay. Therefore, I found that HENOK is majoring economics at Yale University. Yale University is one of the 8 Ivy League schools in America. When we talk about Ivy League school, these are schools that are difficult to get in. You got to do a lot of homework to get there in. But none of you, okay, should be left behind. If you aspire, if you work hard, you can be in Harvard, you can be at Yale, you can be at Princeton. And there were many of your peer groups, Ethiopian ancestors, who are now getting their education at Princeton, at Yale, at Harvard, at Stanford, and also many notable public universities that are as good as maybe as, you know, Yale or Dartmouth and so on. I happened to go to school at University of California, Berkeley, in California, and that is reasonably good school. I mean, you know, it's fine, you know. So I did my PhD there and I started teaching. So HENOK happened to be an econ major from Yale University. Just to give you an information, last year there were a lot of applicants to get to Yale University. Guess how many students applied? 50,000 students applied to have admission at Yale University. How many of them have been admitted? 4.6% of that 50,000. I want to leave this math for the young ones to figure it out, okay? So this is essentially a little bit of mind-squeezing event. So HENOK is one of those good students. Worked hard. He was not there, you know, he was admitted because, you know, HENOK's hair looks different, or HENOK's look, you know, especially handsome, but he worked hard. He must have done quite well in his high school, you know, transition. So I'd like to bring HENOK to serve today as a motivation speaker. And so I will call for HENOK to come forward, and please try to provide the information you have so that our children will be well informed and be like you when they grow up.
So thank you, so much for that introduction. I hope all of you have been well and that came home safe, came here safe, and weathered the cold well. To introduce myself briefly, my name is HENOK. I'm a rising senior at Yale, majoring in economics and minoring in the humanities. And so with that being said, I was asked to prepare a speech regarding what uniquely Ethiopian identity might look like for those of us born here in the United States, but also more broadly to those of us in the larger diaspora community and in the West at large. So we'll cover a lot of ground today, and my aim will be, within all this, not to teach you what to think, but to provoke in all of you how to think. So to the extent that I say something useful, feel free to write things down for further reflection, especially as we'll have a Q&A session later. So with that, our task is to outline upon what we must place our identity as Ethiopian Americans, but this is impossible to do without first understanding the climate in which we live. And so the first part of my talk will attempt to set the scene. What kind of life does our American Constitution guarantee for us? Under what assumptions was it created? And how and why has the American project of liberal democracy failed? I'll conclude by offering a solution to reclaim the kind of purpose, hunger, and vigor which we have now lost to the clutches of individualism, as well as briefly outlining what living a genuinely authentic, meaning and purpose-driven life might look like within the context of being young Ethiopian Americans. So first, setting the scene. What does current life in the West look like? Under which assumptions do we as Americans live? And what problems and issues is our generation particularly prone to? Charles Taylor, perhaps one of the most accomplished historical philosophers of our time, does an excellent job of describing what he calls the malaise, or the illness of modern life. Surprisingly enough, this is what he calls individualism, something which often goes unquestioned in advanced educated societies like ours, and something which is praised as being the crown jewel and highest achievement of Western society. We now live in a world where people have a right to choose for themselves their own pattern of life and to decide in their own conscience what convictions to espouse, all in a way totally unavailable to our ancestors. The same freedom, however, was won at the cost of denying and destroying higher and more sacred orders, such as those that have to do with God, our families, and our communities which raise us. At the very same time, these higher orders restricted us, whether that be in terms of our occupation, our sexual orientation, our mental beliefs. They also gave us meaning and purpose. For Aristotle, telos, and a sense of real magic to the world and to social activity itself. In comparison with social orders of old, our lives have been flattened. To borrow an idea from the Catholic worldview, time has a dual nature. On the one hand, time is secular. It goes from left to right. But on the other hand, time is also sacred. It also moves up and down in conjunction with the religious holidays. The former remains to this day, but the latter has been lost altogether. Technology has only worsened this flattening. Life has so easily lost its richness which we once had before. The average teenager spends around 8 hours a day on their phone, and numerous studies point to the kinds of effects on our mental health as we pursue superfluous connections with people we don't know all that well. We can only maintain significant relationships with around 200 people at one time, but the number of followers on our IG rarely reflects this fact. Individualism, philosophically speaking, leads to relativism. A key feature of living in our democracy is the ability to, despite the diverse backgrounds of our classmates and neighbors, to live in peace with one another. But how exactly is that peace achieved? For younger persons in today's world, the answer is clear. As long as we're all happy and choose for ourselves the way in which we pursue our own self-fulfillment, everything should work out. This kind of loose relativism, however, has proved to be more dangerous than meets the eye. If everyone is on their own pursuit towards self-fulfillment, then why should I be concerned with issues greater than myself, whether they be historical, religious, or political? Why have such responsibilities in the first place, which necessarily restrict my freedom, the crown jewel of Western life as we see it? This is one danger then, the destruction of meaning via the destruction of responsibility. Meaning and responsibility are two sides of the same coin. Though authenticity and self-determination is a good, neither can be the highest good. In the modern conception, we are unable to live authentically without being able to express ourselves. Self-expression, however, uses language. But language is not something you make. It is something that is learned by you from your parents. In fact, using language, you can actually learn more about who you are in discussion and in dialectic with others. This is why Plato's go-to method for discourse is his Platonic dialogue, a back-and-forth conversation between philosopher and student. In other words, you can only circumscribe your own identity only by interacting with the identities of those around you. So much for total self-determination. But what about choice? Surely we need not be total individualists to merely affirm the power of choice. Here lies, however, another issue. Choices only make sense if and only if things are important in light of something else, or in light of what philosophers call a horizon of meaning. In other words, the fact that you made a choice is uninteresting and unimportant, ethically speaking. But what is important is why you made that choice. Choice then assumes a moral backdrop, a system of values, or the idea that somewhere out there in the universe exists a moral good and something which you should live your life according to. There is then something more important than just you. This, however, begs the question, what exactly are those goods that are out there, and how do we flesh it out at the individual and at the communal level? Given the accepting nature of our democratic political constitution, we must and cannot answer questions like these. The Constitution guarantees for all of us life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, a classic utilitarian reference. Utilitarianism being the idea that we should attempt to guarantee happiness for the highest number of people. Fine, great, but this still begs the question, what is happiness and what are its sources of value? This then is the illness or malice of modernity. American life offers no guidance and no structure by which we can navigate key life questions like these. Rights abound, but why do they exist? And how do we settle moral disputes in which two rights clash? In the case of abortion, whose rights come out supreme? That of the babies, that of the mothers, and why? But before even attempting to resolve that issue, where do rights even come from and who endows them? If the state, then rights are arbitrary and unique to certain political realities. If God, we have some traction. On these kinds of issues, political discourse is silent. If we are truly honest with ourselves, the American public sphere, in short, what is today for us politics, has absolutely nothing to say about either issue, especially if there is no clear, universally agreed upon, moral, ethical system which adjudicates rights. In fact, to bring these issues up often means to offend our neighbor, or worse, to encroach on their free-thinking abilities. The American Lawyer Association, the most prestigious association of lawyers in the US, has remained silent on this issue for years, and for good reason. Throwing away higher, sacred, transcendental orders like these, namely of God, church, community, and a universal human nature, also threw away the very foundation of human rights themselves. The absence of this moral backdrop of meaning explains to us then the origin of concepts, important concepts like rights and human happiness. But this is only one failure of our democracy as it stands. Our issues cut even deeper. Not only are we confused and left to answer these difficult life questions by ourselves, but things like love, community, and discipleship have utterly collapsed. Self-fulfillment takes center stage. Unconditional commitments like marriage make less and less sense, while we still, if we are honest with ourselves, yearn for deep romance and acceptance by the other. Birth rates are on the decline, more and more are born out of wedlock, and the nuclear family is slowly being destroyed. Sex becomes utilitarian, a tool for self-pleasure and self-fulfillment, and human intimacy becomes utterly divorced from its purpose, child rearing. All these things are slowly destroying our own economy. The rich are getting richer and the poor even poorer. With the dissolution of marriage comes the dissolution of home buying, the #1 predictor of intergenerational wealth. We've become less and less satisfied with ordinary spheres of life, of hard work, of family, of community, and have become increasingly obsessed with exotic ways of living, of travel, of career obsession, of consumerist narcissism, and flashes of wealth, despite our lack of it, all to hide our terrible bouts of anxiety and insecurity as to our place in the universe. We live in a time where rights abound, but moral systems to help us think through those rights do not. Political elites who don't care about you, but only care about being re-elected, have continued to wage war on your mind. Traditional conservatives attack abortion and technology, rightly, but will in the same sentence support untamed capitalist enterprise, which we know for a fact cannot and has not taken care of our poor, or the earth which God has bestowed upon us for that matter. Liberals, on the other hand, proclaim the importance of protecting our forests, rightly, but demonstrate in favor of on-demand abortions on the grounds that a woman's body belongs exclusively to her. Discourse is fragmented, there is no common good, and we cannot hold discussions about these kinds of issues with our neighbors, our fellow human beings, without becoming violent. Despite our talk of peace, love, and acceptance, we all seem on edge and too quick to raise our fists towards those who disagree. Whatever happened to the kind of discourse Martin Luther King, Gandhi, and regardless of your own religious position, the Christ of the scriptures left us with? Of peaceful demonstration. Of dying for your beliefs, as Christ did, to make a statement, rather than killing your supposed enemy, who is in actuality your fellow man. This is the state of our country as things stand, and if we are not careful, we might just bring about hell on earth. So in light of this, what should be done? As young Ethiopian men and women living in the West, how can we help? Not only in regards to these issues described, but also ourselves in our quest for meaning and a rock-solid identity. Do we need to totally throw out individualism, totally stop affirming the power of choice, and revert to some kind of theological monarchy of old? Or worse yet, become a boomer, and all of you should shudder and gasp. These two seem extreme. So, with that being said, our objective should be one of retrieval, of retrieving the things which have been lost in the past, namely superstructures of meaning, like we said before, God, family, and church, while firmly holding on to newer, more modern freedoms, which, unlike in any other time of human history, have allowed us to live authentic, choice-worthy lives. In times of old, you were born into a profession, usually your father's or your mother's. Your marriage was arranged, and you lived, worked, and died in the same village. Meaning then was mostly given to you rather than something chosen. Today we suffer from the opposite problem. Our choices in occupation and in spouses are so numerous that we suffer from paralysis by analysis. This, however, if dealt correctly, is a good thing. In the best case, if you end up choosing the right spouse, end up choosing the right job, one that's personally fulfilling to you, the kind of fulfillment you'd get, historically speaking, is incomprehensible. At the end of the day, authenticity is a good. It is not, however, the highest or most important good. Our culture is right to point out the fact that in order to have a rock-solid identity, we must think through and discover for ourselves the many issues and questions that we've brought up so far, rather than simply inheriting our answers from our parents. Questions like these: in what does happiness consist? How do we trace out what kind of life is worth living? And how do we do all of this in relation to our fellow man? However, we cannot perform this kind of thinking by ourselves and for ourselves. Just because your identity should be initiated by yourself does not imply that it should be about yourself. And I'll say it again. Just because your identity starts with yourself, it does not mean your identity must end with yourself. To think this way is to remain vulnerable to the flattening of meaning that we talked about earlier. If my identity is fully self-referential, then what is the purpose of it all? Why make choices to begin with if there is no good out there in the larger universe, in light of which choices must be made? The highest good cannot and is not just us, just self-love, just self-realization, or for that matter, just human beings. Taking God as a prime example of a transcendent moral superstructure, if a loving God does not exist, to what end was I born? None. To remain consistent with the statement, you must be a philosophical nihilist, or someone who believes that life is utterly meaningless. We are, in this view, victims of a cosmic tragedy, alone in a purposeless, rightless, loveless universe fated to die on a little blue rock. Morals are thrown out the window, and with it, so must love of neighbor. In order to avoid such a conclusion and the collapse of personal significance, we must remain open to larger horizons of meaning, horizons which historically have centered around God, family, and community responsibility. These kinds of higher callings are the only things which can give us self-fulfillment. So in light of all of this, I propose a middle way, one in which we borrow the moral superstructures of old, namely God, family, and community responsibility, while constructing a framework to think through the choices we now have to make as modern global citizens. So, practically, what does this look like? We'll now trace this out and outline what this means to you as men and women, as Ethiopians, and as God-fearing human beings. But first on gender, where I'll now read one of my favorite poems, William Butler Yeats's Adam's Curse. We sat together at one summer's end, that beautiful, mild woman, your close friend. and you and I talked of poetry. I said, a line will take us hours maybe, yet if it does not seem a moment's thought, our stitching and unstitching has been done. Better go down upon your marrow bones and scrub a kitchen pavement, or break stones like an old pauper, in all kinds of weather. For to articulate sweet sounds together is to work harder than all these, and yet be thought an idler by the noisy set of bankers, schoolmasters, and clergymen, the martyrs called world. And thereupon that beautiful mild woman, for whose sake there's many a one who shall find out much heartache on finding that her voice is sweet and low, replied, to be born woman is to know, although they do not talk of it at school, that we must labor to be beautiful. I said, it's certain there's no fine thing since Adam fall, but needs much labor. There have been lovers who thought love should be so much compounded of high courtesy that they would sigh and quote with learned looks precedents out of old beautiful books. Yet now it seems an idle trade enough. We sat, growing quiet at the name of love. We saw the last embers of daylight die, and in the trembling blue-green sky, a moon, worn as if it had been a shell, washed by time's waters as they rose and fell about the stars and broke in days and years. I had a thought for no one but your ears, that you were beautiful, and that I strove to love you in the old highway of love, that it all seemed happy, and yet we'd grown as weary-hearted as that hollow moon. In the poem, Yeats is essentially describing a discussion of poetry with two women, one passive and one quiet, and the other, the beautiful, mild woman, which is so clearly the object of his affection. What this woman says, however, is extremely interesting, and perhaps the crux of the very poem. We must labor to be beautiful. As far as personal identity goes, while the poem seems to be discussing something totally different, a casual discussion of poetry in a garden, Yeats seems to be getting at the heart of the gender divide. Women are beautiful creatures, but this beauty comes at a cost. The statement on the part of this beautiful, mild woman has two meanings. On the one hand, beauty is not easy. It's not easy to look good, and this is something the businessmen, clergymen, and cleaners of the world, in other words, the men in your life and those with masculine energy, can never understand. There is, however, also a deeper meaning to her statement. Labor does not only refer to work, it also refers to the act of childbirth itself. For the young woman in the crowd, the lesson then is clear. Be beautiful, mild woman, for whom the paupers, clergymen, and businessmen fawn for and die for. But prioritize this beauty not only by cultivating your looks, which necessarily fade, but through thinking through the issue of motherhood. This is perhaps the most beautiful contribution you all may give to humanity. You all, if you choose to marry, and you all should, unless you wish to be a nun, will gestate within yourselves the next generation, spend time with them, and raise them. In short, do as you see fit work-wise, but do not be deceived. Prioritize your relationships and start thinking through these feminine issues while you're young, for your beauty, in every sense of the word, depends on it. Cultivate your divine feminine energy and surround yourselves with older women who have life lessons to teach. Do some reflection. What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? If you want to be an honest woman, find yourself an older mentor who is an honest woman. When you cultivate that kind of relationship, over time, you will, like magic, wake up an honest woman. This is the power of what Aristotle called the virtues. Living a virtuous life is only possible if we surround ourselves with the right kind of people. This is essential not only to your beauty, but to your happiness itself. A similar but different lesson can be drawn from my young men in the crowd. You all are the future business and clergymen who will one day run the world. Your task will not be easy. The title of Yeats's poem refers to Genesis 3, in which God places a curse on humanity. For men we will shed blood, sweat, and tears till the day we die. You were born warriors, but you were also born sacrifice, what Shakespeare's Falstaff calls cannon fodder. Born as shooting stars whose lives will inevitably come to an end, but while you are alive, if you work hard enough, your life will be one of power and glory. The world will spit on you, challenge you, especially as young black men, and there will be times where women who appear beautiful and mild will cause you indescribable heartache. Still, remain true to yourself and to your God. Cultivate your masculine energy and authentically define for yourself a strong sense of mission. Do some reflection. What makes your blood boil? What issue do you see in the world that only you can see? And which injustices have only you perceived, which makes your warrior spirit want to fight? Even if, like Homer's Hector, or like Beowulf, it ends up killing you. What talents has God given you, spiritual, mental, academic, or otherwise, which will aid you in your journey? Once you have an understanding of that, surround yourselves with male mentors who will, in virtue of the kind of men they are, help develop you into upstanding men who are capable of making the kind of impact on the world which we as men spiritually crave. In short, for all of us, some part of our identity is gendered, and this is something we cannot escape. This, however, is not a bad thing. I think as young people we should become more comfortable with these kinds of rigid structures which have given human beings a kind of comfort, meaning, and purpose since the dawn of time. So, from Yeats, we learned our identity is gendered. And ideally this informs the kind of life we end up living. Still, how do we deal with being Ethiopian Americans, especially during times like ours where our home country is fracked with violence? And how do we deal with what is for many a sense of shame from being from a backwards third world country? On our part, the first step is acceptance. Like we spoke about earlier, our identity cannot be totally self-determined. Language being a case in point, your very language is given to you by your parents. This aspect of all of our personal histories is unavoidable, and we do disservice to ourselves by avoiding it. But acceptance is different from a healthy pride. To bridge this, we remember who we are as a people. Around 80% of Ethiopia's land is dedicated to agriculture. At the end of the day, we are inherently an agrarian people. A people close to our land, true shepherds in every sense of the world. A people humble enough to raise children and orphans not our own, and a people communal enough to eat together on a shared common plate. Of this, we should be unmistakably proud. Our story as a people draws remarkable parallels with God's own story, one that involves his chosen people, a small group of monotheistic shepherding tribes located in the Near East, a people who we now call ancient Israel. To be a part of this church is to accept an invitation to become part of this larger narrative. a narrative which did not start with you. When we forget this and place our identity on something else, purely authenticity, purely our tribe, purely our socioeconomic status, or purely who runs the state, the false god of the world, the result is inevitable violence. Violence towards the other, leading towards endless bloodshed, and violence towards the self, best exemplified in modern anxiety, worry, and confusion. Self-determination and authenticity is a good, but it is not the good. You all are children of the Most High. And this transcendent being, who circumscribes goodness itself, desires an intimate relationship with you. Recognize that your narratives do not begin with you, and avoid the temptation of soft ideals such as being spiritual but not religious. Just as human relationships are bidirectional, so is a relationship with God Himself. Just as He extended His love for you, best exemplified in the unnecessary act of creation, He requires something back. What He requires is virtuous practice, self-discipline, communal discipleship, and communal responsibility informed by masculine or feminine energy. Carefully think through issues like these, and you will be well ahead of your peers in terms of carving out a rock-solid identity rooted in the very source of moral value, God Himself. So, finally, I'll leave you all with this. From the very beginning of our talk, we've outlined issues with the Western way of life, and ways in which our generation is so woefully unprepared to tackle important life questions. We then learned the importance of moral superstructures, God, family, and community, of masculine mission and feminine beauty, which give meaning and structure and provide a moral backdrop to our modern conception of authenticity, which we have now successfully retrieved. The very modes of existence upon which we are so dependent in the West, love of neighbor, peaceful discourse, and democratic political interaction, are all borrowings and reinterpretations of ideas originally found in the Christian scriptures, period. None of us would be sitting in this room with access to the same educational resources as whites if it were not for the radical thinking of the great Martin Luther King. But where did King's ideas come from? On the one hand, Gandhi, a peaceful Indian activist whose demonstrations were critical in the Indians' fight against systemic English oppression. But on the other hand, owing to his training as a Black Baptist pastor, surely Christ Himself, whose ideas of spiritual freedom from sin necessitate a reality of social freedom as well. In a time when Christ was expected to be a kind of political Messiah figure, a leader who would violently wrest away power from the bloodthirsty Romans, bringing them to their knees, His crucifixion remains the ultimate sign of conquering via submission. And for our purposes, the cross is the source of all modern forms of nonviolent protest themselves. On rights for women and children. If it were not for the work of church fathers like Augustine, born 500 years after Christ in a patriarchal North Africa, but who openly declared women to be intellectual equals of men and the crown of creation, there would be no conception of the co-educational university as we now know. On democracy, we see in the early New Testament, in the book of Acts, a unique, unadulterated version of communal engagement. The disciples, after the ascension of Jesus, are careful to pool their wealth, take care of their poor, and make decisions as an entire group. Is this not the kind of political reality which we all truly yearn for, but has now become bastardized in our polity, so much so that 51% of Americans can force 49% of Americans what to do? Is this a peaceful, loving resolution to the political issues which plague us, one in which love trumps hate? Or does this, regardless of which aisle, politically speaking, that you fall, sound like tyranny of the majority, which Plato so strongly warned us about? And finally, on the subject of our talk, authenticity. As Owen Barfield notes in his wonderful essay, Philology and the Incarnation, the coming of Christ had radical effects on language itself. Language before Christ was physical. It referred to objects in the world, while language after Christ slowly took an introspective turn. Words like right no longer meant just true to the narrow path, but more so in line with my own personal feelings. The incarnation, the move of an inaccessible God becoming an accessible human word, gave way to new availability of a rich inner life which we all now enjoy and take for granted. If any of these concepts mean anything to you, human rights, rights for women and children, rights as a colored African people with a unique narrative, true and unadulterated democracy without any aspect of coercion or divisiveness, and truly authentic modes of living and self-expression which are not inherently self-referential, but inherently communal, then we would do best to investigate the sources of these ideals, because these ideas are, one, not obvious, two, unique, and three, not present in any other religion or belief system, period. If we are honest with ourselves, and if we wish to remain morally consistent while avoiding the plight of Nietzschean nihilism and the collapse of horizons of meaning, then we must begin a move towards the source of it all, God Himself. May He bless you all, and may He guide you during this critical time of self-discovery and self-reflection. Amen.
My question to you would be, what would you tell your younger selves about before you started your college application process or in high school? What advice would you give to your younger selves?
I think one thing I would tell myself was, my story is a little untraditional because I was applying to college during COVID-19, so it was very stressful. And all I was thinking about was what would be financially feasible for my family and myself, because I didn't want to put my family in distress. And I'm sure seniors now are feeling that too, trying to get scholarships and things, but I think I would tell myself, do what makes you happy, don't do what makes other people happy, because sometimes when you think about other people, you kind of neglect yourself and you may not be happy with the choices that you make. So yes, make financially smart decisions, but ultimately you're the one that's going to school, so do things that make you happy so you don't regret. That's what I would tell myself.
I think I did a decent job of this in high school, but I would definitely, hammer in just cultivating relationships with teachers. So what gets you into college is primarily your essay and also your letters of recommendation. So you just taking 5 minutes of your day to stay after class, ask questions, just be a personable person, and cultivate those relationships. Those go a long way when you ask for favors in terms of them writing you letters of recommendation. So
Going off on relationships as well, in my high school, I was really close to the College and Career Center. She helped me get scholarships, she helped me pick the right schools. Be like really close to your college and career centers and your counselors. They're there to help you, utilize them. Public or private school, they're really there to help you, so utilize that. That really helped a lot.